Hi, this is Guy Wallace. I started in learning and development way back in 1979, and I semi-retired in 2023. But my current mission as a semi-retired L&D professional is to help enterprise learning and development organizations become more performance-based. Welcome to my podcast. Good day, Joe. First of all, let me thank you for agreeing to do this podcast with me in my new podcast series. To start off, could you do three things for me? Could you introduce yourself, give us your name and your background in the L&D space and your interest in performance improvement, etc., and then just name the tool or technique that you're going to talk about today. And then the third part is to share with us, where is this appropriate? Where should people think about using whatever it is you're going to discuss with? Is that good to start with?
That sounds great, Guy. And thank you so much for having me on your podcast. It's a pleasure to be here. So I am Joe Dunlap. I am the Global Director of Training Development at the CJK Group. I have been learning development for 25 years now. Started off as an instructional designer and stand-up facilitator back in the days when we were using PowerPoint and overheads and things like that. And of course, have grown as the industry has grown. And over time, started moving my mindset away from that one and done, the learning course, the workshop, the things like that, to more being focused on what are the expected performance outcomes. Because I wasn't seeing the results that I wanted to see, not only in my work, but in my colleagues' work. And so there was just this realization that we were not hitting the things that we needed to hit that were of value to the organization. And that led up to my most recent job here at CJK and the development of what I call the performance-driven learning model, or PDLM for short.
Well, thank you. So where would I use this PDLM?
Absolutely. So I use it at the beginning of understanding the performance gap. So what PDLM does is it defines by your organization, by the team, by the leader, by any metrics that are available, what moves the needle on performance. So that's the P in this equation. And so the formula goes P equals S, which is skills application, to the X, plus C, which is capability, to the Y, and then plus K, which is competency, to the Z. So those are the three variables that matter to us at CJK because we are a manufacturing organization. So how you apply those skills, how you now adapt to different situations that come from the manufacturing environment, and then how that builds up to your level of competency in your role on those machines really is what drives the performance metrics that we see at the back end of all this.
Very cool. All right, so we've dipped our toe into it a little bit here, so take it away.
Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is the whole X, Y, and Z to that formula. And those are actually weightings to that. And so when you define what is of value, so in my case, the skills application, the capability, and the competency, what does that mean to that team, to that leader, to the overall performance of that particular individual? So for an entry-level role at our organization, how they apply the skills is probably weighted much more heavier than both capability and competency. As you move up that career ladder and you become, for instance, the lead operator on a machine, your competency is weighted much heavier than, for instance, your skill application or capability, because you will have grown those as you've moved along through various roles to get to that level. So what it does is identify what it is that the leader and the team value most from that formula, which then allows me to put my focus in terms of the resources, the training, the job aids that I'm going to be developing for that particular role based on what it is they value the most. So getting back to the previous point, if it's an entry-level role, I'm probably channeling, based on at least the numbers that I have, 60% or more of my time is channeling on how they're actually applying those skills after learning them in their role. And then again, like I said, as they grow to concussive roles, then it's like, how well are you now adapting to different situations, the capability part, that gets a heavier weighting down the line and eventually to your competency.
Thank you. So can we circle back here and talk a little bit more about skill application and what it is and what it isn't, and then capability and then competency? Because I think a lot of people would kind of could blend all of those things into one,
Yep.
hulking thing, and you've kind of fragmented them. And
Mhm.
so, give us a definition and an example of each.
Absolutely. So, skill application is those things that you have learned in your training. How are you now applying them on the job? So, this comes through both observation and hard metrics that are available to you. So, if I were to give you an example of our industry and you're a roll tender, as an example, how are you now putting the paper roll onto the machine? Are you webbing it up correctly? Are there any wrinkles? Are there any tears? Things like that. So these little things that would impact overall performance if you don't get those right, that are easy to measure and observe in that individual. So those are the things that skill application is that you've learned how to do this. We've talked about this. Now, can you demonstrate to us that you can actually do that work? The capability is, I would tell you that probably 75% of the time, Guy, when we get a job ticket for a job, it's pretty standardized. But the other 20, 25% of that, it's specific to the customer. So how do you now adapt to those changing situations in the typical job performance, or excuse me, job ticket that you get when you're presented with something you haven't seen before? How are you now applying those skills in an unusual situation? So as again, if you might be, it's a changing job ticket, or we need you to work on a different machine, can you take your skills and now use them on a different machine and still have the same level of performance? And then eventually the competency is how well do you put all that together into a measurable result? So I'll give you an example. My expectation of somebody who's in that role reading a job ticket, as I was just explaining, is that probably by about 5 months on the job, I need to see that you understand every job ticket 100% accurately and that you can read it in under 2 minutes and do the work. So that's a hard measure from a competency standpoint that we're looking at.
Well, very cool. So skill application, I've learned something, I can apply it. Capability means that I can apply it in additional performance context and kind of broaden that out. So I'm broadening that skills application, if I understand this correctly.
You are correct. Yes.
Okay, very cool. So can you tell us? So if I wanted, or anybody in our audience wanted to apply this, of course, you got a couple of LinkedIn articles about this, and you've written about this in other places, and you talked about it on other podcasts. So I'm going to put links to those in the show notes so people can follow up on that. But step by step. So where do you start? You get a request. I don't even want to preface it with you get a request, but so what's a typical starting point for you when you say, I've got to use this model, this framework here, and establish, I believe what you're doing is, on the front end, is establishing a baseline so that you can compare results later on. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah. And for some roles, it was very easy to establish a baseline because it existed, especially when you think about the lead operator. My biggest challenge was for the other members of the team because those metrics had not been established. So there was a lot of hard thought. And the first step was defining those performance outcomes. And that was the biggest challenge I had, Guy, was I was asking, the lead operator, the supervisor, what defines good for somebody in this role? And even though they could talk about it, they had never put those skills together with that. They had never put together a thought process from a training plan perspective of, well, how do we now grow those skills? And what does it mean when we want them to apply those skills? So that was the definition first, is defining the performance outcomes. And then the next thing is identifying the priorities. So again, to that P, what is your S, your C, your K, or again, depending on your organization, what are the important variables? And that can grow. Ours was very simple. Again, manufacturing, it's skills, applications, capabilities, competency. Some people could throw in engagement or retention as examples. So they could be, that formula can grow and shrink based on, again, what moves the needle at your organization. So after I've done those two, I step back. So something you're very familiar with is now I'm looking at HPT and ST. I want to understand the bigger picture around this role. So like many people probably in a manufacturing environment, what my individual contributors doing in their role is impacted by somebody else, and what they do is impacting somebody else. So that's the important part to understand, is you doing your work correctly to this level of standard of performance. This is what that means to the person who's waiting on you're part of that product coming down the line to them, that why they need to get that right, because otherwise you basically are stopping the machine and you've got to start that all over. And that's what we call rework, and we hate rework. We don't want to do that all over again. So once you kind of get that idea around the whole idea of the HBT and systems thinking, then you can kind of move on to the performance focused. All right. So now that you understand all those impediments, the barriers, as well as those things that help move performance, now you can tie into that as well. So you can kind of define your training plan around that idea. The fourth step is leaning into the workflow. So one of the things that I try to do, so now you're stepping back to your actual work as a learning and development professional. What are the tools and the technologies and other methods that our employees are using? So instead of using learning technology that delivers across, MS Teams, for example, or other work platforms, why aren't you using MS Teams and those organizational work platforms? Because there your work is transparent and it's familiar to the people that you're actually working with, And so instead of moving yourself further away from them, move yourself closer to them. Fifth, forecast the future. I'm really lucky guy in that I get to see 6 months down the line of what our work looks like. We've already sold the next 6 months. So we know what the work looks like. If we're going to upgrade a machine, I know that's going to happen months ahead of time. If we're going to buy a new machine, I know that's going to happen months ahead of time. So that's not to say changes don't happen, and they do, and they're unexpected. Workforce capacity, somebody calls out sick, or we had a last minute customer request or something like that. But being able to look into the future as far as I can helps me now from a capability standpoint start planning those learning experiences for that individual, that once they're on one job, and let's say that job lasts for a month as an example, I can look forward and say, well, what that next job is, and say, okay, part of that training plan is now you've learned this skill and you've applied it. Now we're going to then take that skill that you've applied in this situation and put you into a brand new scenario. But I want to make sure that they have the resources available to them, because again, a month has passed, they'll probably have forgotten what I've learned. And then step 6, create that hypothesis. That's to tell everybody your story. Here's what I think the problem is. Here's what I'm going to do about it. And then I have a backup plan or two in case this doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. So the waiting part of this, if you're looking at future work and you know that there's going to be this particular work and it's going to shift the work over to a different set of machines or whatever, you can see where your need is to broaden somebody from their skill application current state to a future state of capability. But so how does the waiting fall into place in all of that? It would seem to me that would kind of help you focus a little bit more on certain aspects of things than on other things. And is this waiting something that you get agreement with your client from? So it basically reflects what they think about what's important and what's not.
Exactly. And so what I do is I kind of set a parameter around that, and I say, I'm going to give you, obviously we did the S and the C and the K, and I say, now you have 3 variables here of where I need to focus my time, and it's out of 100%. So where would you want me spending the bulk of my time for this role? And again, entry-level role, most of them say is, look, we really got to get that skill application right, because if we don't, they're just not going to be able to go to another machine or adapt or what have you. So that has to be the priority. So that allows me to then focus a lot of my effort on, for instance, that entry-level role on that skill application piece. And then think further down the line that as their work is going to change for them, if it's a new machine, or we can see again into that future and we know that the work is going to change for them. As we get closer to that timeline, we can start building up their capability, and I can make sure that I have the resources that they're going to need when they actually shift gears to whatever is next down the line, and so forth and so on. And then again, always building up to competency. So it's kind of staged in a way of what your planned training is you're thinking of it in very small increments. Is okay, they're going to be doing this job for the next month or very 2. So this is what I'm building now, but I'm already looking into the future down the line of what am I developing next for them to start building out those resources as part of the plan.
So have you got any helpful hints for those who might want to dig into this a little bit and try this out?
Yeah, so I got a couple of them. The first question is, does anybody want this, right? So before you jump in and say, I'm going to do this, make sure that they actually want it, right? It's got to be desirable. It's got to be feasible. It's got to be viable. Those are the business terms, right? So you want to make sure that people are ready to go to that place with you before you just go off and run down there and start using the formula and developing your training around that. You want that buy-in from the people that you're working closest with. Second is check the culture, right? The old saying is culture eats strategy for breakfast and operational excellence for lunch and everything else for dinner. Is the culture ready for what it is that you're bringing to them? If it's not a good fit now, play the long game. Start implementing it very slowly in very small increments to get buy-in over time to start changing the culture around that. One of the things that I like to tell people is think like a healthcare professional. So if you've been under the care of a physical therapist or a nutritionist or what have you, you understand that they don't think of as a one and done. They're thinking of helping you progress to your optimal performance, to your optimal nutrition, whatever the case may be. And I encourage you to think the same way. As it's not the classroom. It's about continuing your growth and helping the people to grow. Get in on the action. Whatever you uncover in the HBT or systems thinking analysis, get your foot in that door. If you're seen as part of the change agent that's improving performance, even if your work is extremely small, you become much more valuable. I have my hands in so many cookie jars, but I'm fortunate in that I'm allowed to get my hands in all those cookie jars. And I think my value to the organization is recognized because I'm willing to step in those places where there is a gap and nobody's filling that space for what might be a barrier on the job. And then, like I said before, leverage what you've got in-house first before you work outside, right? So those technologies, before you go buying a learning operations technology, what do you have internal that can work for you? Before you buy development technology, what do you have internal that can work for you? Before you, use learning measures. What are the measures that the organization is? And what I think most people will find is that processes like system thinking, HBT, performance-based ISD, those are already there in some way, shape, or form. So integrating them is not going to be that hard.
Yeah, that was one of the things I appreciated in your article, talking about, use what your customers already have. Don't foist upon them, my words, something new and different. Use what's familiar to them, and because you're dealing with them in their workflow, use what's ever in their workflow. And if it's not in their particular workflow, if it's elsewhere in the company,
Yes.
you're just basically leveraging prior investments and all of that.
Exactly.
And that's a nice segue to I wanted to ask about the resources that are available. Now, I know you wrote this article for Spark Magazine, and you've talked about this in the Skills Roundtable Reimagine with the Richardson Consulting Group, and you've talked about this in Workplace Learning and Performance Alliance that Bob Mosier and Conrad Gottfredson have. So tell us a little bit about, where would you point somebody to, and is there a progression? Look at this one first and this next one after that. Where can people get help in learning more about this and more particularly their skills application of this?
Absolutely. So I would tell you, start off by joining the ISPI, the group on LinkedIn, right? So the International Society for Performance Improvement, that's the group that puts out HBT along with a number of other certifications. You've been a part of this for years, Guy. You helped build all this. And so that's where people need to start. If you want to understand HBT and what that means in relationship to system thinking, then that's the place to start. Because again, you want to be thinking very broadly. Instead of going with that training first mindset, that helps you step back and say, well, what are the other things that are impacting this? And I would imagine, except for some very new learning and development professionals, most of the people out there would agree with me that you've implemented a training at some point that the manager said, no, you don't need to worry about that. Right. So that's the part of the environment you got to understand is if you're going to do something and that manager is going to basically shoot it down, well, pull back from that for a moment. You need to have a different conversation around all that to engage that manager before you implement that training solution. Because again, that's that whole culture thing. It's going to eat it for breakfast.
Yeah.
So ISPI, get familiar with systems thinking. Now, I say that with the thought that there are 15 different models of system thinking. So just do the basics, understand what system thinking is about. So therefore you can have a really intelligent conversation internally with how do they apply systems thinking there internally as well. Talk to your IT department. what technology do you have that you could use? You'd be surprised if you have MS Teams, and I use MS Teams a lot because that is fundamental foundation for us, that you can develop learning in MS Teams. You can deliver that through various channels. We set up learning channels for chat groups and discussions and things like that. So, and the IT department will love you for the fact that you actually came to them and asked them that question. So in addition to joining those groups and talking to your IT, if you're lucky enough to have a performance management group in place, talk to them about what they do. If people are following a certain model of performance management, maybe you can tie into that so that people, again, have a better idea of what the work you're doing is in relationship to how their work performance goes. In addition, some of the sources that I particularly use to get my insight is like the World Economic Forum. They put all kinds of reports out. LinkedIn has a newsletter called Work Trends that I also follow to see what's going on in the world of work. I would also recommend the Harvard Business Review and MIT Sloan Management Review because they've got their fingers in what's going on in HR and L&D within a corporate environment. And so I tend to kind of look at them as well.
Yeah, very good. Thank you for that. Sure. So what I like about your tool is that it starts with applying what people have learned, skills application, and then moves into capability, expanding that. It's almost like going from something that's perhaps near transfer to something that's a little bit further away and further, and they may need a little help in making that transition to another context, another machine, or whatever that variable is that the learning was focused on. And then wrapping it all up with competency and weighting that, because I think that sometimes we think that, if we put our own biases to something, we may prioritize something that's not really the customer's priority. And this kind of a model gives you something to anchor your conversation to, something to be more specific about with and get clarity with the client in terms of, okay, once they understand, the model, they can basically be directive in terms of where they want your attention as a service organization within the larger enterprise.
Yep.
If we could shift gears here a little bit, one of the things that I wanted to do with this podcast is to highlight people who have this performance orientation in learning and development, and also beyond learning and development. So do you have 2 or 3 names of people that you would point our audience to for others to follow up with, to follow, to learn from?
Absolutely. So besides yourself, obviously, Bob Mosher and Dr. Conrad Gottfredson, right? So they developed the 5 moments of need. They have the Workplace Performance and Learning Alliance. So they obviously recognize the importance of addressing people as they're doing their work and providing those learning resources to them. They developed a model around this. Nick Shopton-Jones, love him. He does tend to be a little heavier on the learning design side, but he certainly draws out the whole point of you need to understand what those performance outcomes are before you get into your design mindset. And then there's another gentleman I follow, probably not as well known, named Paul Jocelyn. And he has a really unique mind. He does a lot of posts out there with regards to understanding the organizational environment, understanding change management and performance, and what that all means in relationship to what you're doing from a learning and development perspective.
Very good. Yeah, I would agree. Those 4 people, if you combine Bob and Conrad, if you separate them out, they are. I guess the key thing here is that there are, in fact, many people who speak and think about performance and systems thinking and looking at things broader than a learning and development module or output, and how that can impact performance and all that stuff. And so I think people can broaden their thinking about this L&D domain and look at it more holistically, do some systems thinking around this by looking at people with different perspectives. One of the things I learned a long time ago, decades ago, was that a lot of us in this world use different language and labels and imagery, but it really is all kind of the same, because I challenged Gary Rumler and Joe Harless at different points in time about all of this, and they kind of begrudgingly said, "Yeah, but we're in competition, so we can't use the other guys, language and labels." And I said, "You know how difficult that made it for me climbing that learning and performance curve way back when? I mean." And so, but I think that that's just the way it is, and we're not going to be able to solve or resolve that. And I think that's something that the audience needs to appreciate, that they're going to have to kind of demystify each person's stuff, their language, their labels, the imagery that they use, and look for what's common. But the gold is probably in the differences, the unique perspective that some of them take on it, and I think there's a lot to be learned from that.
Absolutely.
Let me shift gears here again one more time. Can you take a couple of minutes and talk about what you see as the biggest problems or opportunities, being two sides of the same coin, I think, that there are in what I call enterprise L&D or corporate L&D, or whatever language you want to give that. But what do you see those issues being, and what are your suggestions for tackling them?
Yeah, so if I were to, I thought about this. If I were to simplify this, is that many of us in L&D do not understand what it is the CEO wants from our work. And that's a simple way to sum it up, because again, that ties it all back into performance, right? And unfortunately, Guy, we've created this $350 billion beast for all things learning, because we assume that CEOs care about learning. And the reality is your CEO doesn't care about learning science. They don't care about learning methods, design, experience, measures, whatever else. They care about results. They care about business results. They want faster innovation, better adaptability to market demands, better products and services, and employees who can solve problems and grow and drive growth. And if you think about each one of those items as an example, we could have our hands in every one of them doing something, because they're not that far away from the work that we're doing anyway. So if you understand more about what it is that the CEO wants from us, then you can start to move your work more towards what's going to make an impact that the CEO and the C-suite actually value. And to kind of get back to the ideas that we were talking about before, you got to start with the problem. And that's the whole HPT and system thinking and the formula and the work that you've done is, let's figure out where it is the CEO wants to go. They want to improve sales results. They want to improve our market standing, whatever it is. Okay, well, what does that mean from a performance standpoint? And then what is the environment around all that I now have to address to move the needle on that?
Yeah, I agree. And I was thinking as you started off here that the CEO doesn't want to know how you make the sausage. They just want you to make the sausage.
Yep.
My apologies for my phone going off there. I had really turned it off, but old people, what can you do?
Not a problem.
Anyway,
I use the analogy here. I'm like, I don't care how you score the touchdown. I care that you score the touchdown. And when I say that to the operators, they get it. They're like, okay,
yeah,
we all got to get to that place. So
yeah, there are many roads, many paths to success. And while we may teach or help people learn one, it's that going from skills application to capability that broadens that out. And so there may be some nuanced differences when you're going from one context to another. But I think that's really important here. That's one of the things I really liked about this was this acknowledgement of that we can focus on a piece of knowledge, a skill, a behavior, a competency, but it's the broadening from one application that we might focus on to the person's ability to transfer that into slightly different, because if it's vastly different, that's a whole different story here. But I think a lot of the performance context, there's just nuanced differences from one to the other, and people need to learn how to think about that, to prepare themselves to perform perhaps a little bit differently, to examine their own work before they move on. I think that's all very critical.
I agree.
So let me wrap this up here. I want to thank you, and I will put your LinkedIn URL so that people can follow up with you. And again, I'll put in the links to the 2 articles that you currently have. And by the time I post this, you may have that 3rd article out on LinkedIn to go into this. But I will include the links to some of your other places where you have shared this. But thank you so much for sharing with me today, and for our audience. We wish you well.
Thank you, guys. It's been a pleasure being here.
Thanks. Bye bye.